Hello, very beautiful community. Let me know if you can see and hear me. We're going to be a small group today, and we're going to talk about ethics and morality in politics and in our private lives too. And we're going to start by asking ourselves, can you see and hear? Alex has preempted me, which shows that everything on the channel is getting a little bit too repetitive. So we're going to scroll up ritualistically and try to take a few questions that were left before we started. Echelon. Decaf coffee treat. Beautiful community. That's about the amount I'm allowed on a good day. Considering that there are different groups of people with different moral standards, is there such a thing as moral sanity? I think that there are two thoughts you can have about moral sanity. One is a thought about balancing closeness and distance, engagement and disengagement. So let me give you an example. Imagine that you are young, or that you have a child or a grandchild who is 20 and they've gone to work in an orphanage in sub Saharan Africa. And imagine that their reaction is, well, I don't really care about any of this because none of this affects me and none of this is my country. Too cold, too disengaged, too repressed, too austere. Imagine their other reaction is, oh my God, how could this be happening? How could God, they happen to be religious, do this? They're secular. How could the universe generate such human suffering for kids? This is getting sentimental. This is getting so engaged that it's becoming disengaged via losing track of the context into which you need to put the experience of the orphan children, namely that there is a world, and that in the world there are human beings, and that some human beings are children, and that some of them are sick, and that some of them are sick and disadvantaged, and that this is an example of the latter. Closeness and distance. One of the great balances of closeness and distance in the history of Western thought is the great German writer and aphorist Lichtenberg, right? Writing 300 years ago. In a way, if he were on social media, he would go viral because he wrote sentence or two sentence long interventions. The second element of sanity, ethically, is keeping a balance between all the ethical pushes and pulls that you experience, that is a healthy balance, an exploratory balance, rather than a rigid and evasive balance. I mean, let's take the most banal and trivial example. Here I am speaking to 111 people, sipping a cup of decaf. And what are the moral pulls and pushes on me in this tiny instance? Well, infinitesimally, they are. I've been feeling quite sick today, so sitting up like this has been a challenge. I couldn't have done it a couple of hours earlier. So my question is, am I going to be able to give enough to the beautiful community given how I'm feeling? And the answer is yes. Am I going to damage my health for the next day or so by pushing through and doing a live? My partner is here from the countryside. She's going away again tomorrow. So if I do this, will I have any energy to interact with her later? Am I going to cause, I'm going to be ludicrous now, the answer is obviously no. Am I going to cause myself emotional pain by talking about moral questions in a live because I'm a moral philosopher who can't be a moral philosopher properly because they're sick? Because if I hadn't been sick, I'd already had 2 moral philosophy books published. Is this going to cause me pain? No, of course it isn't, for goodness sake. I'm not 17. But on you go, on you go. Now, all of these factors, yeah, properly balanced, uh, dancing, or rigid tights. And moreover, are they dancing with non moral factors? One way to be a good person is to make the non moral choice or the less moral choice. If you're a parent and you try to model to your kids that every choice you make is the best choice ethically, it shows you're rigid, it shows you have no passions, it shows you have no sense of play, and so on. Sometimes moral considerations have to get out of the way, just like artistic considerations have to get out of the way for an artist, which doesn't make them a lesser artist. If Giacometti has worked all day and then he wants to go and have a 4-hour dinner, that's not a failure toward his artistic output. That just means he is human, right? So, closeness and distance and balance. John Kiros, Vlad, what about the Marco Rubio speech to Europe? Because of the topic today, I won't answer that extensively, but it's really fresh news. Let me just say 2 sentences. Marco Rubio's speech is important because it's Marco Rubio and because he's speaking at a very important event. Beyond that, it's not very important. He does not speak for the Trump administration. What he says is contradicted by their actions. Moreover, even if he were to become, which is very unlikely, even if he were to become the next president, he would not be able to significantly reverse any of the forces of US decline in state capacity and US withdrawal from the world. Stephen, I'm an American. I'm having trouble reconciling conservative mantras like give me liberty and give me death and don't tread on me with their tacit acquiescence to Trump's slide towards authoritarianism. So I've just said something that was about balancing many different pushes and pulls and not drawing a clear line. Here, I want to draw a clear line. Trumpian politics is not conservative. A, because it's revolutionary, it's out to transform society. B, because it is not tied to any of the conservative images of sustenance and perpetuation across time. And C, because it is explicitly out to break democratic institutions. That doesn't mean that you treat Trump voters like crap and make the terrible mistake of thinking that what's gone wrong for them is an intellectual failure or a moral failure or both. You can't reduce citizen loss of trust to these two factors. Most progressive media does that. This is wrong. This is progressivism's equivalent of Trumpian delusion. People are not voting for Trump because they're misinformed in the first instance. That's true too. It's not the main cause. People are not voting for Trump because they're morally malign. It's a factor, actually, because there are certain kinds of politics that liberate our destructive impulses, and Trumpism is one. It's not the main cause. The main cause is a catastrophic collapse of the perception that you have any political agency caused by social forces that we often discuss. So don't confuse this by thinking that what I'm saying is inviting you to dismiss them as being intellectual and moral delinquents. That's not the case. Right? So disgrace to Hillary for talking about um, uh, Trump voters in a deleterious way. I'm covering up for a brain fog slip. I have no idea what she said. Come on, come. Deplorables. Yeah. But putting that aside, I do want to draw a clear line here. When the public thinker and historian Neil Ferguson goes in with Trump, Neil doesn't get to say that he's making a conservative choice. He just doesn't. He's making a revolutionary, anti conservative, anti institutional choice. When the UK commentator Konstantin Kisin says the world needs Trump, he's not making a conservative choice. He is not making an institutional choice. He's making a revolutionary choice. The way this is tricky is that most people in that position don't think of themselves as making a revolutionary choice. Or at least they partly do. We need to just smash through the calamity caused by centrist technocracy. And indeed, I saw a tweet today, just logging in now, from Konstantin Kisin saying that Marco Rubio's speech was great and a real illustration of what America is all about, how we should respond to it. Let me say that's debunked by the 2 or 3 sentences I uttered earlier. So you have to draw a clear line and tell people, I'm not going to take your bullshit. I'm sorry, I'm just not. I'm just not. This is not a conservative choice. The trouble is that this is really hard to see because this is a political generation of authoritarians dressed up in conservative clothes. And it's worse than that. It's a generation of ex-conservatives dressed up as authoritarians in conservative clothes. And so people tend to think, well, this guy was a sort of conservative 10 years ago, so must be one today. No, right? Nigel Farage is not a conservative. Now, there is the counter argument that's going to come, which is, look, we need to do something about the legitimacy crisis generated by technocratic centrism. And so somebody like Neil Ferguson might come along and say, well, in many ways, a Harris or a Biden presidency can be thought of as an existential threat to the United States. You say that's about Trump, but I want to say that about them too. Now, is that true? I think that at the level of institutional damage, obviously not. At the level of damage to social trust, yes. Yes. Biden, to some extent through his policies, although his policies were more progressive than most Democrat presidents in recent history, actually, to some extent through his policies, but to a greater extent through his absence of narration and incapacity for communication, undermined trust in the United States. In a different way, Kamala Harris would have done this too. So I do think there is a sense in which Kamala and Joe Biden would have been could be thought of existential threats to the United States, but they're existential threats. Doesn't mean you've got to think of them as enemies. Absolutely not. They're existential threats which are a lot less threatening than Trump because they're not attacking institutions. They're just really not very good at all for sustenance of social trust. So I would have crawled and walked and ran and whatever I needed to do to vote for Kamala over Trump because Trump is 5 times more dangerous to the United States than Kamala is. And this is the problem in our culture where 2 things can't be kept in mind by intelligent people anymore. Yes, there are all sorts of problems with technocratic centrism. But I mean, we just did a video yesterday where we played a clip of my Foreign Secretary, Vet Cooper, speaking about Mr. Navalny. And I pointed out her dignity, her thoughtfulness, her intelligence, her integrity, compared to the sort of deformation of human and political personality you might get if a reform representative was speaking on part of the UK. So we've got to understand that what's happening for these folks on the X-right, that they're failing to keep 2 things in mind. Yes, there are all sorts of problems with technocratic centrism that are very, very existential. They do threaten the sustenance of democracy in the West, sure, over time, because they're just going to be conducive to the devolution of trust. But that doesn't mean that Trump's an improvement on that, right? Any more than the fact that my microphone here has a poor connection problem with the wire would be improved if I smashed my monitor screen. It wouldn't improve on my situation of the malfunctioning microphone. But it is true that my microphone is malfunctioning. And in our culture, we tend to say, no, the microphone isn't malfunctioning, or it is, and a good thing to do about it is to smash my perfectly functional screen. They're struggling to keep two things in mind. And I don't, and here I don't tolerate not drawing a sharp line. So I'm not impressed that Neil Ferguson is making a constructive choice. I'm not impressed that he's making a conservative choice. He's losing his rudder, zero negotiation, 100-0 here. Right? It's not a sort of 80-20 situation, 100-0. It's a clear line, right? And so basically the answer, Stephen, is they don't get to do that without being called out for their bullshit. Right? There's an enormous amount of bullshit out there today. This is a very central form of political bullshit you're pointing to. Don't jump from the fact that these people are presenting bullshit to the wrong conclusion that you can just epistemically and morally dismiss Trump voters, but do not negotiate with them on this bullshit. It's just total bullshit. And it's ludicrous and laughable and farcical and embarrassing. Right? Alex, materialists often call virtue cultivation impotent versus structural forces such as capitalism. I can't help feeling that these arguments are morally empty. Where does their moral force come from if not a buried liberalism? We go through phases of, in our public discourse, underplaying and overplaying structural forces. One conclusion that is very important to avoid is the idea that individuals make no difference to history through individual intention. I mean, all intentional action is individual, but not all political change is a consequence of intentional action. Roughly. The question then is, where's the balance? Let's take an example from Russian history, even though I've talked about this, and I'm sure you, Alex, have seen the video on the Philosophy Channel, Do Individuals Change History? Which is really about collective versus individual social explanation. I think that if, take two examples from Russian history, because we talk about that sometimes. If Gorbachev had been Chernenko or Andropov or one of his own predecessors, including Brezhnev, he wouldn't have allowed the USSR to break up without violence. And insofar as that's true, the USSR just wouldn't have broken up when it did break up. It would have gone on longer. Part of the reason there was some limited violence during the breakup of the USSR, but not more, is that Gorbachev had a fundamental commitment that violence shouldn't go far, shouldn't go beyond a certain point. And biographically, nobody else in the history of Soviet leadership would have been in that position. And that's to do with Gorbachev's wherewithal. It's to do with his education, it's to do with his personality, it's to do with his love for Raisa, his wife, and so on. Equally, it's not clear that there would have been a revolution of any kind in 1917 had Tsar Alexander II, who was relatively progressive, not been assassinated in the early 1880s. Right? Individuals make a huge difference on the one hand. On the other hand, so much is a product of various kinds of structural factors. Where are we in 2026 in the West? I think it depends a bit which part of the West. In the United States, where you guys are very dreamy, often nauseatingly optimistic, often pious about the magical origins of your own country, um, oblivious to history that preceded the existence of your country. A wonderful byproduct of these traits that can be negative is a certain sense of freedom, a certain capacity for reckless action toward individual transformation, right? In terms of entrepreneurial psychology, the United States obliterates Europe. Um, but today, in the US, structural factors are dramatically underestimated. If you look at non-cultural political commentary in the United States, non-political cultural commentary, non-political cultural interventions, like for instance, the very pinnacle of self-help culture, not the trash, the good stuff, like Tony Robbins, right? Tony basically doesn't understand structural disadvantage. Right? Mostly, this is also true of what I have called the hyper identity movements. In other words, Black Lives Matter underestimated dramatically not just the importance of actual politics, right? Because BLM had a liberatory impact on the way a lot of people individually thought about their racist dispositions, but it cumulatively did not have a positive effect on um, big political power. Right? BLM does not make a Trump election less likely; it makes it more likely. And one of the central problems with BLM was that it didn't emphasize class enough. It didn't emphasize class enough in the dynamic of racial deprioritization in the United States. Not that BLM was wrong about racial deprioritization. Racial deprioritization is a very big factor in US society still. Um, but class was almost comically underestimated by that movement. And it ended up being, to a good extent, a kind of a surface fluff movement that Marx indeed would have giggled at, would have laughed at. For missing certain absolutely central factors that you can't miss if you're going to be a realist about social forces. So today we're going through an age where we underestimate structural forces. I grew up in a society that overestimated structural forces, the Soviet Union. It inclined one to want to say that all explanation is in fact detached, explanation of large social events, not why Igor next door repaired his car unsuccessfully, but large social explanation, why the Afghanistan war started by the Soviet Union, explanation of these kinds of things. It was invited that they should be thought of in terms of structural factors, which was obviously going far too far with structural explanation. Um, okay, so we need more structure, but we can go too far with structure. We need more structure when it comes to class in the West. When it comes to progressive thought about disadvantage, class isn't a big enough factor. Doxon, I wanted to say thank you. Ross, do you think that for many people, morality becomes a sort of irrelevance in societies where hyper neoliberalism holds sway? Well, to a certain extent, that's constitutively true, because if you hyper neoliberal, the opposition is that everything is out there for you to buy or grab by force if you can't buy it. But strictly speaking, the answer is no, because hyper neoliberalism is a deformation that does not sit cleanly in most of its proponents' minds. So when Putin acts like a radical hyper neoliberal, as though might is right and there is nothing else in the world, um, he is doing a little bit of toxic damage to his own mind, and he hates himself for it. Putin is a guy who is very big on self-loathing, right? So what I'm saying is, when we do hyper neoliberalism, we go on as though a certain kind of economy of moral sentiment no longer applied to us, but still does. It's just that we repress it and try to hide it from ourselves in the subconscious or unconscious mind. Rune, what would be a healthy way to think of morality in regards to today's fractured political world? You want your political representatives to be ethically adequate, even if they have dirty hands, and even if often ethical considerations have to get out of the way for reasons of compromise or for reasons of, if you like, necessity. And by necessity, I mean questions where the ethical issue doesn't arise because there isn't an option for an alternative course of action. So it's a kind of a pre ethical must. Um, There's a story that Stephen Greenblatt, um, the wonderful literary theorist and Shakespeare expert, likes to share about how he met um, Bill Clinton at some kind of literary event at the time of the Lewinsky scandal. And Stephen Greenblatt likes to say that he said that to Clinton while shaking his hand in a kind of outbreak of boldness. He said, and there was somehow connected with Shakespeare, the event, and he said, the thing about um, Macbeth is that he is a man who, upon attaining power, couldn't stop himself from doing irresponsible things. And Clinton, continuing to hold Greenblatt's hand, said, um, no, the thing about Macbeth, and or Greenland may have said that he was somehow lost his moral compass as a result of having too much power, and Clinton said no. Specifically, what's distinctive about Macbeth is that um, uh, he is a man who has lost who has an ethically inadequate relationship with power. The implication being, I have many flaws, but I have retained an ethically adequate relationship with power. Forget about whether you think that applies to Clinton, but it's generally a very good distinction Clinton generated there during his handshake with Stephen Greenblatt. There's a distinction between whether a politician does good or bad things, too many bad things, and the core question, whether they retain an ethically adequate relationship with power. Yes, I screwed up. Yes, I behaved in this irresponsible way toward my family, toward my country, toward a young woman. But um, when it comes to war, taxes, corruption, I remained ethically adequate, and that's the core question that matters. So you don't want your politicians to be ethically perfect. You want them to be ethically adequate. Forget about Bill Clinton as a specific example. That's a good distinction for what you look for. Okay, I think we have completed our ritual of answering everybody who was there before. How should we think about madness as a force in politics? Reality can break down for the powerful, and almost all of us are addicted to magical thinking. Absolutely. I mean, before social media, Mr. Tough Guy is asking the question. Before social media, the best way you could have felt your way into this is by going to an event that may have been a protest or a public action with more than a couple of hundred people for a cause you half agree with. And what happens when you're in that crowd, you begin to agree with it by more than just the half you thought you agreed with it before you came, because of the incredible enveloping momentum of the crowd. Even if it's some kind of, you know, meeting about local education policy. Um, so it's very important, I mean, to think about this. Without saying anything too deep in it, the psychiatrist Anthony Storr wrote a book about human destructiveness about 40 years ago. Forget what the title is, but the title, the word destructive is in that title. Um, it's important we think about this. The biggest way I think we should think about it today in the West is in terms of the sort of politics we were critical of earlier, authoritarian right politics, ex-right authoritarian politics rather, liberating destructive impulses in us. Um, and that's really a factor we shouldn't over milk. We shouldn't get into conversations again about how Trump voters are just immoral and ignorant. But nevertheless, there are destructive impulses at work there. There are destructive impulses at work with all of you too, but I don't think there's anything quite as destructive in the West as that conveyor belt of post truth authoritarian ex conservative politics. And this comes with all kinds of perceptions of liberation. Um, and these need to be psychoanalyzed, including the liberation to be gleeful about bad things happening to your political opponents, almost in a way that is eroticized, right? Being exhilarated and thrilled by the minutiae of bad things happening to your political opponents. Unfortunately, a lot of the glee about the actions of ICE does take these forms. So it's worth talking about it. Maybe I'll get Peter. Peter's very good. Peter Pomeranz is very good on this. Maybe I'll get him on to talk about this with me in 2026 on the channels. Thank you, Vlad, for grounding us. Any advice on pointing out when you think something is astroturfed by foreign interference without overreacting? How do you draw that line? The biggest thing you can tell yourself is you've got to be able to think two things at once, not one or the other, right? Not this person is a Russian asset and it's got nothing organic about them at all, or it's all completely organic and there's no Russian interference at all. You've got to hold both things in mind. And then you give it a sense of proportion. And the sense of proportion always is that the Russian interference or Chinese interference or whatever is going to play a much smaller part than domestic forces do. But you got to weigh that for yourself in each case. Sometimes the foreign interference could play a disproportionately large role with some particular occurrence. But keep two things in mind at the same time. The psychology that's wrecking us is a psychology that's not allowing adults whose equivalents 20 years ago could have easily done this to keep two things in mind at the same time. It's a huge, huge problem for us. Huge, huge problem for us. I mean, Ukraine good, but bad in this particular aspect. It's an unthinkable thought for a lot of people in this ecosystem, but that's deranged, and it's completely unavailable to you, versions of you 20 years ago, because normal humans don't think like that, right? So there's a kind of a purification of thought into completely unreal categories in virtue of the deployment of identity, right? You identify with a thought as opposed to thinking it. How do you feel about historical revisionism, including attempts by hyper progressive activists um, to claim that Shakespeare was a black woman, and how do these attempts affect trust? They affect trust a lot less than they did 5 years ago because hyper-identity politics is in decline. We need to watch out for it in higher education institutions. But now a bigger threat is, quite frankly, authoritarianism. Is quite frankly that you're at university and you can't say bad things about Trump. We're not there yet, but we could be there 10 years from now. That's by far the bigger threat. As for hyper-identity politics, historical revisionism, the thing I'd say about it is that very often, because it doesn't take structural factors into account properly, it, funnily enough, disrespects the ethnic minorities it focuses on, right? So there are people who claim that we respect Beethoven um, because he is male and white, and that we need to look deeper and see if we can find female composers from the same period who would have been as good but weren't at all known. And that underestimates how deep of a feminist you need to be to properly grasp um, that you're pretty much not making it if you're a woman trying to be a composer born in 1770. So it's not that women were allowed to develop their talent and then we didn't notice it. It's that women weren't allowed to develop their talent. So a lot of the hyper identity, historical revisionism about women, about Black people in the past in the West is, funnily enough, too neoliberal. It's too shallow um, and pleases itself too easily with some kind of little consumerist twist of saying a nice thing that then's going to sell well, which in fact doesn't properly grasp the depth of the structure of the disadvantage in the particular historical moment being talked about. Um, so that's how I begin to think about that. That takes us back to Alex's point of underestimating structure. How does one deal with the tension between individualism and collective welfare? Um, well, first of all, um, there are certain things, Gaffer Bob is asking this, there are certain things which are collective goods in virtue of which you couldn't have a society at all. Or we couldn't have anything like the kind of society that we have. So, for instance, if you had a society where a large portion of it simply do not have access to healthcare, that's not just bad for them, it's bad for the society as a whole. Directly, because people are going to catch other people's diseases, or people are going to be disadvantaged by these people getting knocked out from the economy. Um, or uh, there is then something else, which is that we are committed in the West, including conservatives, to something like the idea that people shouldn't be made to suffer the really bad consequences of sheer contingency and bad luck. In the first instance, you would say that there isn't a conflict between that kind of individualism and collectivism because we're talking about things that are the needs of the needs of groups, which, if they're not met, is going to make society worse for everybody. Then there are things where that's also true, but less obviously true. And in that case, you could more easily talk about conflicts between various kinds of collective and individual values. There's not going to be any one conflict there. There's going to be a plurality of conflicts. Even if you pick out two particular values like equality and liberty, they're not going to conflict straight between each other. There is going to be no socially available conflict between equality and liberty. There's going to be a conflict between certain conceptions of equality and certain conceptions of liberty, just like there is going to be a conflict between certain conceptions of equality and certain other conceptions of equality. And there's going to be a conflict between certain conceptions of liberty and certain other conceptions of liberty. So here you're going to be swimming in a carousel of 27 or 77 different conflicts, all of which need to be responsibly weighed. Alex is asking, how do we get a better ethical caliber of political leaders? This is very difficult. one obvious way to do it is to pay them properly so that A, they're motivated to do the job, and B, they're motivated to not be corrupt. Um, in the UK and in many countries, we underpay our political representatives dramatically relative to the level of responsibility they have. The trouble is that doubling or tripling the pay of political representatives, which would be, if you like, normatively impeccable, if you could um, get the population to support it, is going to be dramatically unpopular. Um, in a country like the UK, it's going to be very unpopular to increase the pay of members of parliament by 50%. So, members of parliament arguably have a responsibility commensurate with the country head of a global NGO. And these people are going to be on, let's say, in pounds, 200,000 plus, roughly. Whereas you're going to be way under 100 if you're a member of parliament. But you're working, you know, most waking hours of the week. You have a lot of responsibility. It's a pretty, and everybody hates you. It's a pretty unattractive job for that level of pay. And almost all the possible alternate jobs a member of parliament could do outside of politics will be much better paid for them. So that's not the answer, but it's just one element of this conversation that's complex. You are not also going to get people to go into politics in a world in which politicians are hated as much as they're hated today. There are all kinds of self-perpetuating mechanisms here that are very difficult to stop, vicious cycles, but you have a real problem. I mean, people who I know who are in their sort of 70s, 80s, who have taught at elite higher education institutions all their life are saying that a certain small chunk of their students in the 70s and 80s wanted to go into the politics. Now nobody does. So this is difficult, and we're not being pious or sort of ethically nostalgic when we say that in many countries things were better 30 years ago when it comes to the pedigree, quality of politicians. Um, I think, I'm all over the place with this answer. One thing we could do is cultivate in the public a sense of the difficulty of the job, a sense of the stress of the job, a sense of the limitations political actors face. But it's very hard to do when there are so many entrepreneurs and charlatans. And when a lot of people look out into politics, they think, well, half of you are either entrepreneurs or charlatans, entrepreneurs or perhaps some kind of post-truth populist. Um, you know, the hell with all of you. I don't trust you. Um, this is very, very difficult. And it's worth having maybe a long conversation or an article or a main channel video about what a revival of ethical adequacy in political leadership would look like, what it would mean to strive for it in practice. So I don't have an answer. How did people, Jan is asking, after the centuries of the Middle Ages, come back to the idea of democracy? Well, first of all, there is political progress and political regress in history. Secondly, don't underestimate the unacceptability to us of ancient democracy. And its exclusionary nature, right? A democracy that was predicated on the sustenance of slavery and the um, exclusion of women from political life is not going to impress us. Um, but there's still a lot that we can learn from the ancient world. Too interesting, too big a question for us today. Bookie Boy is saying, thank you for me giving clarity. Yeah, and my pleasure to answer your question. Has your mug gone to the front line is a troll question. Let's have a look at super things I've missed. What's a good way to answer people who argue that politicians always choose power over principle? So politicians are very power driven. But what you want them is not to be not power driven. You want them to be power driven responsibly. I'm not sure I want politicians who are not power driven at the pinnacle of politics because they're not going to be good with dealing with a lot of power, which is terrifying and complex and compromising. So you want your politicians to want power. What you want from an ideal politician is somebody who is very confident about being able to use power well and with an ethical dimension. Chester is saying, how have we gotten to a point where a large swathe of people not only tolerate but seem to revel in causing cruelty to others? ICE is an example. Well, um, my great colleague Avishai Margalit, the philosopher, Israeli philosopher, likes to say that a uh, decent society is one in which a government doesn't systematically humiliate its citizens. And a civilized society is one in which its citizens do not systematically humiliate one another. In a world where we think of our opponents as political enemies, and in a world where destructive impulses are disinhibited, um, this is inevitable. And unfortunately, it's an important question because this is going to get worse. Now, what we're seeing in the United States is that it is institutionally stronger than most European democracies, but its democratic culture is more toxic than any other major Western country right now. And this is only going to get worse. Um, so there are two kinds of question here. One is, what do we think about these people ethically who are in that predicament of the liberation of destructive impulses? The next question is, what's our explanation psychologically of how they've got there? And I will be speaking about that. And the third question is, what do we do? What do we say to them? And that's very difficult because we're torn between saying the most effective thing, which is to treat them as political opponents, even though they're treating us as political enemies, on the one hand, and on the other hand, telling them to go F off. This is connected to our previous question because these destructive impulses are disinhibited by irresponsible political actors. That's one of the most damaging things of the Trump administration. With every word its unlovely representatives utter, these disinhibitions magnify, and they're very difficult to put back in the box. You can sort of slow them or you can magnify them. You can't put them back in the box. So this is very, 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 very difficult, because also destructive behavior begets destructive behavior. In other words, if you go out there and, start being mean to homeless cats on the street, that's going to trigger you to be more mean to more homeless cats. So there's a self-perpetuating effect with the liberation of destructive impulses in a single individual. And that's very, very difficult, because we don't just have a problem, therefore, we have a problem that's to a degree exponential. And you get drunk on it. You get drunk on behaving badly. And another mechanism that's very important here is when you have a populist leader who looks like they're speaking to you in kitchen table talk, it almost feels that mean things they do are things that you do, that they're things that are done vicariously. And that is enormously empowering. When Trump is mean to people, that can be extremely empowering to his voters, because they feel that they are doing what he is doing. Whereas if Kamala Harris were president, nobody would really feel that they're doing what Kamala is doing. But there is this um, collapse um, that occurs whereby people think that they are Trump. And therefore they're lured into the bliss of destructiveness. We'll talk about it more. Hasan Piker, Chester is saying, has been getting a lot of flack for saying he'd vote third party over supporting Gavin Newsom in 2028. Hasan Piker argues that Newsom's neoliberalism would embolden the Republicans long term. I don't know what Hasan Piker is up to these days. I haven't watched any of his stuff. I've seen he's been saying nice things about China. That's all I've noticed. So I don't know. I don't know how to categorize him. What kind of a thing he is. I would say that there are some people for whom it is ethically right to not make the effective political choice. It's a complex conversation who these people are, but they're a minority. For most people, it is okay to take the hit and compromise and vote negatively. So, my preponderant recommendation to all of you is that for 97% of you, if not 99, it's going to be right to vote negatively, right? Look at what I said earlier. Kamala Harris would have endangered the psychic fabric of US democracy by undermining trust, and I would have crawled to vote for her if I were a US citizen. So it's very important to be strategic at the time when shit is hitting the fan for our democracies. And there are going to be exceptions, but they're tiny. For most humans, including myself, including nearly everybody in this room, probably even everybody in this room, it's okay to vote negatively. It's okay to say, I don't like B, but I like A lot less. I'm going to go B. The way that I justify this is by thinking about practical consequences. What's going to be the impact on the climate crisis? What's going to be the impact on institutions? What's going to be the impact on key issues we care about? So there is no way you're not going to be able to tell a tangible, practical difference between a more and a less responsible political choice. You will. The problem with saying, I'm going to shove it into both sides is that you then have to have a model of practical transcendence of both sides. And the answer is either you have that, or you're operating in an ethical realm that is a bit pre-political, and that could be right for some people, people with certain spiritual or religious beliefs could authentically and okayishly make that choice because their life is somehow about not compromising themselves in certain ways. But that's not true for most people. Politics is a bit of a crude, dirty, pragmatic business. And there is going to be a difference between bad and very bad. And there's a very big difference between bad and very, 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 very bad. So that's what you do. So would Gavin Newsom, with his current ideas about policy, be the solution that we need to the crisis of democratic decline? No, he'd probably perpetuate it, but much less badly than any candidate on the other side, even Marco Rubio, who's going to be more institutional. So these differences make a difference, and you can think of it in terms of lives and livelihoods impacted. I don't want to get too utilitarian here, but there's also a sort of okay way in which you can just count the numbers, right? How many people are going to be out of a job? How many people are going to not be able to afford groceries? How many people are going to have children who are going to be even more impacted by the climate crisis and so on? So don't think that incremental differences don't matter. Incremental differences are the very essence of politics. They're the very essence of political discrimination between choice A and choice B. Now, one of the great recently living philosophers, Alasdair MacIntyre, Alasdair would have said, vote for neither. And for Alasdair, that would have been right. But we need to tell a complex story about his philosophical and religious background. And then we would say, yeah, for him, it's right to not vote Trump or Kamala. But wouldn't have been right for almost everybody in this room. Mario, do you think that a lack of punishment for elites is endemic to English-speaking countries? No, I don't. See how the EU and even Gulf states have punished Epstein allies faster and harsher than the US and UK. No, the UK is in a political crisis right now because the UK Prime Minister, who never interacted for a second with Epstein, nevertheless is in trouble for appointing a guy entangled with Epstein to an important post, Peter Mandelson. So I would put UK with the Europeans here, if you like, rather than with the US. In general, when elites behave atrociously and nothing happens by way of consequence, this is hugely corrosive for trust. It's hugely corrosive for trust. And funnily enough, it eventually generates support for responsible elites because people feel, well, screw this. I'm going to vote for destructive political options because this political story has simply broken down. My politics isn't working at all, so I might as well throw exit it. But I think that we don't, speaking more broadly, we don't even have a culture of accountability whereby we have vocabulary for how to hold elites accountable for their actions. We don't even have a vocabulary for it except talk about some alternate world in which we have a mini political transformation and relate to these things differently. So we don't have even a proper vernacular for responsibility of elites. And that's a reflection of the fact that we don't even have, we don't have resources intellectually, hermeneutically, to challenge the hyper neoliberal might is right frame. Um, this is connected with lack of solidarity and lack of a conception of a public good in our societies. We're so fragmented, we're so divided, we're so segmented, um, that it's it's hard to talk about anything that's, if you like, owed in virtue of standards of behavior, um, to the country as a whole. Um, so consequences for elites really matter. I appreciate the distinction you are drawing, but I still think that even in Europe, we lack proper vocabulary to even talk about this stuff. Let's go 15 more minutes. I'm not frozen, I'm just reading. Realistically, there is a whole generation of progressive politicians who are also not up to saving democracy. Nick Stroh is saying, um, leave some room for the adaptability of certain political actors. Take a look at AOC, for example. AOC is developing quite rapidly. She's changed her perspective on a range of key issues. She's drifting closer rather than further away from grasping some of the challenges that we face in contemporary democracies. However, she's also a politician who um, is going to have a very big demographic of people who despise her, particularly on the Trumpist side. Trash is asking, do you think there is a universal non-Western specific morality? Um, the way you begin thinking of questions of universality in morals is in terms of values. So, Trash, you've got some values. Um, you've got some political values. You believe in certain kinds of justice, certain kinds of freedom, certain kinds of equality. You've got some values that are less political, right? You might value um, friendship, you might value play, you might value beauty, you might value generosity, you might value responsibility, or some version of these to a higher or lesser extent than others. And so the way you think about values is that some values are universal and some are not universal at all. So, for instance, a value that is absolutely central to our culture, the value of authenticity. Most authenticity in our culture is bullshit authenticity, sort of me consumerism. But real authenticity is a modern value. It roughly means that you author your life in connection with things you discover about who you really are. And this can't be a blueprint that society gives you. It's an individual mode of exploration. It involves questions like what's me versus what's really me. Um, as much as we all struggle in the West in the job market, we still ask questions: is this job more me or less me? In a way that would have been unavailable to humans 500 years ago. You know, in my company, am I the number two guy or am I the number one guy? Do I want something a little bit more technical or something a little bit more creative? Do I want more or less communication in my job? Am I good at that? Do I enjoy it? Is that who I am? Does it express the best parts about me? Right? Authenticity is a value that's about 300 years old. It's just not there in the ancient world. On the other hand, there are some values that are universal. An example is freedom. Another example is justice. Um, if you find some early humans sitting around in a cave, just 12 of them, they already have the value of freedom and the value of justice, and I would argue the value of truth as well. But it doesn't mean that that value is expressed in the same way in different cultural circumstances. So don't think that just because a value is universal, it means the same thing in different cultural circumstances. It doesn't, which raises a very important question. What should liberty mean for us here and now? That's an important question that I'm interested in, as my PhD work was in. I hope to write a book about that. But even though freedom is expressing itself in different ways in different cultural circumstances, indeed Isaiah Berlin hyperbolically said that there were 200 different conceptions of freedom across history. I do think that it's a universal value because it has a certain kind of universal kernel. And that is that any human being, wherever they are, does not want to be in the arbitrary power of other human beings. So imagine I'm 12 people sitting in a cave and I want to go outside for some fresh air. And somebody more senior in the social hierarchy than I tells me, no, you ain't going for fresh air. I then want from them some kind of explanation about why. And if they give that explanation, I might be able to accept what they say. They might say, uh, uh, you could get attacked. You're too fatigued because you went on the hunt. You don't need to go out again. Or you might do something that undermines our security somehow. And I'll then be able to say, well, even if I disagree with these reasons, I think they are good reasons, and I'm going to engage with those reasons. But if they said, I don't have any reasons, you're just not going because I'm in charge, I feel that I'm going to have a grievance about that. I'm going to want to moan about that. I'm going to want to be violent about it or protest about it, in virtue of more than just my desire to do this thing. I'll want to protest in virtue of my feeling that I'm actually being stopped from doing something that's okay for me to do by somebody else's power. And therefore, something like a universal kernel of the concept of liberty already arises in that cave, because it arises once I begin making a distinction between more and less okay ways of other people's power obstructing me. There is absolutely no chance in hell in any conceptualization of decision theory, I would argue, to get out of this predicament, to get out of the fact that even a primitive human in this primitive environment is going to be forced just by sheer combination of elementary human psychology and rationality combined with the social negotiation of space, going to be forced into making a distinction between more and less okay ways for other people's power to impact what I can and can't do. A universal value has been born. Another universal value would be born if we sit around in the cave and we divide food and we think of who should get how much and for what reason. That process already, with by a couple of more steps, will get us to universal value of justice. If we sit in the cave and one of us goes out to the river to fish and comes back saying there aren't any fish in the river, we might ask questions about whether they looked properly, about whether they in fact found fish and kept it to themselves or stuffed their face with it and lied to us. What's happening here? You're beginning to sense something, aren't you? That the value of truth is already beginning to appear. Because we can ask questions about whether the person looked well at what's going on in the river to judge whether there's fish there. We can ask a question about whether they've been sincere in what they communicated to us about being at the river. And then we can say, well, hang on, if they've lied to us about what's at the river, if they haven't looked at the river very skillfully, we need to replace them. Somebody else from our group needs to go to the river because that person will just not look well enough or not fish well enough or lie to us about what actually went down there. And there might be more food than they're really, that they're saying there is. There might be less food than they're saying there is. You see, we're already having a conversation that locks us in. So we've been speaking for 5 minutes. And we have shown that there are three universal values. Um, Two of them are explicitly political values. Now, are there more than two political values that are universal? That's more controversial. There's no simple answer there. Maybe. There's plenty of other values that are universal in virtue of the fact that we um, share a psychology that is differently expressed in different cultural circumstances, but has a universality to it. For example, reliability is a value. It's a value that's quite interesting because it's not just universal, it's universal and not very differently elaborated in different cultural circumstances, unlike the values of um, uh, the political values we named. Because if you say, I'm going to be there in the afternoon, that's the same kind of commitment, whether it's now or in ancient Greece. And then there are going to be plenty of values that are culturally contingent or historically contingent. They're everywhere in the world today, but they weren't there before. Okay. Okay, last question. We'll take the question from Alex whether it's good to distinguish between ethical and aesthetic values in politics. Um, you could better make that distinction, even though it won't always be sharp, because and I'm going to just give a 2-sentence answer here and then we'll close, because the most glaring example in the recent history of the West in which aesthetic values came to be dominant over ethical values in politics is Nazism. Lots of love and talk very soon, beautiful community. Thank you so much for being with me.